It's Wednesday, May 1st, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behavior comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Kiely and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, he may not be talking to the New York Times right now, but President Biden gave Howard Stern an interview, and what an hour of radio it was. They've been standard in television and radio contracts for decades, non-compete clauses. Now the FTC says no more. It's a big win for labor, but how likely is it that this ban is going to actually go into effect? And 2 more Russian journalists have been arrested and detained. Their charge? Working for the opposition group founded by Alexei Navalny. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but I want to start with the feature on CBS Sunday Morning this week. A sit down with former CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Dan Rather. Here's Lee Cowan.
But in 2006, a little more than a year after he stepped down from the anchor desk, Dan Rather left CBS itself.
Dan Rather was one of the great reporters of his time. Good luck, Dan. All the best.
Dan Rather, CBS News, became sort of all part of my name, a part of my identity.
And you have interviewed how many presidents?
I'd have to count everyone since Truman. Gosh.
This is the first time he's appeared on this network since.
Without apology or explanation, I miss CBS. I've missed it since the day I left there.
Even at 92, how and why he left still stings.
In the heart of every reporter worthy of the name, Lee, there's a message that news, real news, is what somebody somewhere, particularly somebody in power, doesn't want you to know. That's news.
And that's what got him into trouble.
And so as we talk about what got him into trouble, let's remind our audience and kind of bring that detail back into play. It was reporting for 60 Minutes that centered on unverifiable documents related to George W. Bush's service record.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a bombshell for Dan and CBS News, basically centered around the questions that had been there for a while about former President Bush's military service and why he didn't serve in actual war, and whether or not he was even doing the work that he claimed that he was doing. And there were some who basically said no, he wasn't where he was supposed to be or doing the things that he was supposed to be. And there's still some who helped work on that story with Dan Rather, who claimed that their information was accurate. So, but when it came out, Bush and his people said, "Hey, this is wrong. We don't know who you're talking to, but the information, you haven't corroborated the information." CBS then did an investigation. They brought in an independent group to verify the information. They said that there was some problems with the information that was gathered, and it ultimately led to basically Dan leaving CBS, and then everyone else involved also faced some sort of basic banishment, I guess you would say.
Kathy, you had to have been there front and center watching this
I
unfold.
actually am very familiar with this because we were dealing with the same documents at USA Today, and one of my good colleagues was involved, a wonderful reporter was involved in this too. And what happened was, as you said, and we should make this clear, this is George Bush the Younger.
Right.
And that
who was president at the time of the reporting.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
And
in the election at the time.
Mm-hmm. There had been a lot of allegations that he did not fully meet his reserve requirements. He was in the reserve. He did not go to Vietnam like many people of his generation. And there were questions about whether his father, another former President Bush, had pulled strings. The documents involved were papers that purported to show, I think they were memos that purported to show he was AWOL or, not there when he should have been. They were faked, and they were very clever fakes. And so somebody malicious fed these documents to USA Today and to CBS. And that was proven that they were fake documents. I think you're right, Ernest, that there's still an open question about the reserve duty, but the documents, and it was stunning, I think, for both news organizations. So both had to retract, and I believe rather left in part because one of his producers was kind of pushed out the door. So it was a loyalty issue. There was some loyalty involved in that.
I think about all of the stories we've talked about over the course of the 11 years, Ernest, that you and I have been doing this show. Kathy, you joining us like 5 years ago. And the media landscape being what it is today, where would you put this reporting scandal kind of on that spectrum of, if you were to put that into today's media ecosystem and some of the things we see with reporting today and deep fakes today and some of the questions we have about accuracy or how journalists do their jobs?
There are a lot of scandals that I lived through that I think were worse because they were reporters who actually faked things. In this case, these were reporters. You could argue that they didn't do due diligence, although this was a very, very clever fake. And so you could argue that they maybe should have checked more, but it wasn't as though they were willfully presenting information that they knew to be bad information.
Yeah, and looking at this, looking at the story, and placing it in today's news media ecosystem, it would still have legs because there would be another echo chamber out there, or several other echo chambers out there, especially within social media, that would continue to regardless of whether or not it was fake or not, it would continue to drive that story.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because that really is how things have changed. Once that story was debunked, it was done.
It died. We haven't talked about this in 20 years.
Now you can debunk all kinds of stories and prove that they're wrong, and they still have an afterlife. It's like life of the story of the living dead.
Who you gonna believe? Me or your lying eyes? It's pretty much the environment that we're in right now. And this story would have, especially in the middle of a presidential election. Could you imagine if this was Biden? It would just take off.
Yeah, and I remember the way the documents were debunked was that somebody discovered that the typeface on the documents was a typeface that didn't exist contemporaneous during the Vietnam War.
So a font that had not yet been created.
Exactly. It was like an electric typewriter font purporting to be a manual font. That's how it was debunked. But imagine, and that was extremely clever and but imagine today with AI, it's hard to see how that story would ever go away.
Right.
As I was watching this piece Sunday morning, and if those in our audience haven't had a chance to see it yet, they can watch it in its entirety on our Links blog. But as I was watching it, I was kind of sitting there wondering, what was the purpose of this? Was it offering Dan Rather 8.5 minutes of redemption? Was it a look back at somebody who was such a large and almost larger than life figure and having an obit while still alive? Like, so much of this was why now and why in this format? Because it felt weird to watch.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing myself. And, just to be transparent, for the last couple of years, I've served as a judge. Dan Rather has an award for local, mainly it's local journalism, but there have been some national, and it's really about watchdog journalism, and it's run through the journalism school at the University of Texas. And so when I looked at the piece and then I did the reading of the stories that are also on the Links blog, I kept going, okay, what was this? Why did CBS choose to do this? Why did they decide to do it on Sunday morning? Did it have something to do with his Netflix documentary that is about to premiere, which talks about his life, especially his life at CBS News? Maybe it was a way for them to sort of promo that, but that's not usually what they do on CBS Sunday morning.
No, usually you'll see something about a book being published by Simon & Schuster with a disclosure that CBS owns Simon & Schuster.
Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering if that was the reason why, but I did find it a little odd as to why they did that.
And it felt kind of mildly uncomfortable to watch at the same time.
Yeah, a little bit, but I would say this. I think maybe it was a way to sort of bridge the animosity between between Dan Rather and CBS because I mean he is 92.
Bring him back into the fold a little bit of the legacy.
Yeah, kind of rebuilding the legacy maybe.
Yeah, and he's remained an interesting
Incredibly
journalist.
relevant.
Yes,
Talk about that for a second.
He still is out there doing interviews. He works for streaming services. He's never really stopped being a journalist, and he still gets some remarkable interviews. So I think, and the work that he's doing that you referenced, I think his efforts to try to support local news, I think are very admirable. So, for whatever, I mean, everybody has an unfortunate episode in their life, and I think this is maybe one way to move past that and acknowledge that this is, he's really a giant in our field.
I mean, and the other thing too is that when you start looking at the news ecosystem now, the evening news is becoming more and more irrelevant as people are getting their news and information in different ways and at different times. So it's going to be interesting to see how that golden era of Cronkite, of Rather, of
Peter
Jennings,
Tom Brokaw,
how that sort of looks as we go forward. Because I mean, when you start looking at the anchors, I mean, who do we know outside of who?
Yeah. Well, Rather was forced to be cutting edge.
Yeah.
He took that move in a direction long before any of his peers did. So it's kind of interesting how circumstances.
Enough, you talk about being cutting edge. Probably would have been one of the last people you would have expected to see at a conference of the Online News Association. Because the one time I had any kind of interaction, it wasn't even an interaction, because I was walking down the street in Austin when we were there in 2018 for the Online News Association. I was walking with a friend and I said, wait a minute, was that just Dan Rather who walked by in the other direction? He looks at me and goes, oh yeah, when you're a journalist here in Austin, or if you're associated with UT and the journalism school, you see him all the time. He's right there and out there with us all the time. You just see him walking down the street and don't think anything of it.
Right.
And I said, okay, very good. There have been some rumors floating around that President Biden is in a feud with the New York Times, that he won't grant them an interview, and that as a result, the paper is retaliating against him. Interestingly enough, though, he did give an interview this past week, and it came as a surprise to many. The president sat down for an hour with, wait for it, Howard Stern.
Thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks for having me.
Mr. President, look at me sitting with the president.
Look at me sitting with Howard Stern.
Wow, I mean, you can tell people this is the most important event in your lifetime.
Okay, so maybe not. That interview ran pretty much on a loop all weekend on Howard Stern's Sirius XM channel, starting at the top of the hour. And I've only heard excerpts, because I wasn't in the car at the top of the hour at any point, but you can find those as well on YouTube. The conversation went really deep in places that people may not expect Howard Stern to go. Biden describing his decision to join Obama on the ticket after telling him no the first time, why he felt his son Beau was better suited to be president than he ever was. And then even making some news saying that he will debate former President Trump at some point. He just doesn't know where or when.
Yeah, if Trump agrees, that's the other big. Well, no, I think this was a really smart move. I mean, we've talked before on the program about his, he has not given a lot of interviews, Biden hasn't. But this was a way to reach the Fox audience without going on Fox. I mean, really, Howard Stern is a shock jock by trade, the kind of deeply macho, conservative-leaning person who's going to listen to talk radio and would be listening to Howard Stern. So I think Biden chose an avenue that would broaden his audience. And I think it was a really calculated move and a really smart one. And I think, Howard Stern rose to the occasion. I mean, he's no dummy, and he's not going to waste that kind of an opportunity with a lot of ridiculous jokes and outrage. He actually took advantage of it, so good for him.
That's one of the things. Yeah, and that's one of the things too, actually, about Howard Stern, that people are always surprised when they hear me say that one of my favorite movies is Private Parts. Howard Stern's I guess, memoir, biography, whatever, that he produced himself, because the central theme to that is that who you hear on the Howard Stern show is a character, and that Howard Stern, at his heart, is one of the biggest proponents of the First Amendment that we probably have here in our country.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that the fact that Howard Stern said, okay, I have this opportunity, and I'm going to talk about issues, and I'm going to ask questions that really probe into who the president is and what he's doing and why he's doing it. And that, I think, is important, but it also sort of opens up the president to, as you said, a wider audience about it, to be able to talk about that. One of the things that I think journalists get is that they just don't they want to ask those big questions and not ask the probing questions, I guess is the way to put it.
And it's interesting because I kind of want to hang on this Howard Stern thing for a second, because I mean, he asked really good questions we haven't necessarily heard asked or answered elsewhere. We really saw where and how he can shed the shtick, right?
Yep.
And he can get to those issues in ways we haven't seen other journalists really do yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in defense of the other journalists, they haven't had an opportunity.
That's true.
I mean, this is, and I think, again, this is, why does Biden need to give an interview with the New York Times? Those people are, that's preaching to the choir, as far as who are the readers of the New York Times. He needs white, rural men. And that's who he's going to get. He needs young men. That's who he's going to get with Howard Stern. So I think he just made a very calculated. It's not that Howard Stern is like better than other journalists, but he could have asked a lot of goofball questions like boxers are brief, and gone for stupid, jokes. He didn't do that. So good on him. But I think the fact is Biden is choosing his spots. And I think it was
smart on Biden's part and his team's part to basically keep it a secret. I mean, he's going to another event and he stops, gets out and goes in and talks to Howard Stern, unbeknownst to the rest of the press corps. And they are just freaking out, going like, where's he going? What is he doing? How did that happen? And we not know about it. And I think that's part of what's happening, is that the New York Times and others are feeling as if, hey, wait a minute, we're the top of the food chain and we're getting treated like we're...
There's a little bit of arrogance in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
A little bit?
Okay, fair. There's a whole lot of arrogance in there. Yeah. I kind of want to talk about another radio issue. Have you ever noticed that your favorite TV news anchor or radio DJ doesn't normally hop from station to station? Maybe they leave a job and pop up down the dial 2 or 3 years later. That's because they were most likely subject to non-compete clauses, contractual barriers that kept them from taking jobs with competitors. The Federal Trade Commission decided last week to ban that practice. Now, this is a really big deal for workers who now presumably will have the ability to move from employer to employer without having to change cities and to negotiate the best deals for themselves.
Yeah, this was, you can understand a non-compete agreement, and they still will hold, I think, for very top executives. Somebody who knows company secrets and could really...
C-suite level.
Exactly, and could put a competitor at a real advantage. But what has happened is over the years, this has just trickled down, and it's become worse than, people forget before Obamacare that you couldn't move jobs because everything that you were being treated for would become a pre-existing condition.
Right.
So those were the handcuffs that kept you tied to perhaps a less than ideal employer. Now, when that went away, these companies started to push the non-compete deals down into the lower ranks. And so it was practically like if you were with Uber, you couldn't go with Lyft. I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, because a lot of people have both of those. But it was just people really at the grassroots level were chained to employers, and it was a terribly unfair thing. So I think this has been a big move. It will be opposed, though.
I mean, I had a lot of colleagues when I worked in Houston and a couple of other. I mean, even when I worked in smaller markets and newspapers. I mean, it didn't happen so much in newspapers, but in radio and television news, it was huge.
Standard.
It was standard. I mean, but mainly
is standard.
Yeah, but mainly it had to do with the anchors, or it had to do with your high level reporters. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, if you were a beginning reporter, or junior reporter, it didn't matter. But if you had been with the station for after several contracts, then you automatically got bumped into a non-compete clause area. And so, but now it's gone even further down to where you're talking about photographers and multimedia journalists and that sort of thing. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, why are they? They're not on air people. They're the ones who are behind the scenes. Why are they having to sign non-compete clause?
The impact was, if you want a raise, you're going to have to leave town.
Right. And that's a lot of what has created the culture among journalists of having to move from market to market to market. And that idea that if you wanted to have professional growth, you could not have it in the city that you were in because of a non-compete, that you had to almost develop this nomadic lifestyle every 2 to 3 years to advance.
Right. And even if your contract ran out, there was still this clause in there that automatically would trigger the non-compete. I mean, it's the craziest thing ever. So, I mean, they'll figure something out. I think you're right. I mean, they're going to fight this, and they're going to try to come up with some other way to do it. But I do think that this is going to help the workers.
And I would agree with you. Longtime television executive Hank Price has gone on the record. He had something in the blog TV News Check claiming that this is going to lead to salary suppression. I can't get my mind around his argument.
I couldn't get my mind around it either. I mean, I think this is going to open it up for
contraire.
people to be able to do it. Yeah.
Well, okay, Hank Price had his own ulterior motive there. Now, you said it too, Kathy. There is a good chance this does not go into effect in the 90 some odd days that it is supposed to. Part of that is because litigation could put the pause button in play on the enactment of this, pushing it further and further out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chamber of Commerce already has said they're going to file a lawsuit, and then they will, as you suggested, they'll try to get an injunction to keep this from being enforced. So I think it may be a while. We'll see how the courts argue it. But I think it really is hard to argue. I mean, if we're supposed to be a free market, you should be able to negotiate with a competitor for a raise.
Right.
Okay. This Friday, May 3rd, is World Press Freedom Day. Sadly, we must report that Russia has taken 2 more journalists into detention for doing their jobs. Kathy, who are Konstantin Gabov and Sergei Karelin?
Well, these are 2 local journalists, unlike Evan Gershkovich, who we've talked about, who is an American working in Russia. They are Russians. Their alleged crime, as you alluded to at the top of the show, is being associated with organizations that were supportive of Alexei Navalny, who was killed in prison, a potential competitor, presidential competitor to Vladimir Putin. So this seems to be part of a much wider crackdown by the Kremlin on any kind of dissent. It's very disturbing. I mean, 2 Americans are behind bars in Russia for journalism, and now 2 more Russians.
They are, at this point, the earliest their trial could happen could be 2 months from now. Chances are, given what we know about commitment to speedy trial in Russia, not likely.
Well, this is a disappearing act, right? And so and we see this in dictatorships around the world, this so-called pretrial detention. And so they put somebody in behind bars, as they have done with Evan now for more than a year, and keep postponing the trial. So I think you're right. I think it's going to be quite some time. I will just say we're seeing this in other countries. We're seeing this in Latin America. And I will just say to our listeners that on World Press Freedom Day between noon and 3, if you want to come to the Reynolds Journalism Institute lobby, you can sign some letters for Evan Gershkovich and other journalists who are in difficulty, and meet some journalists who have escaped from difficulty.
Yeah, I think it's making it more and more difficult. I mean, right now, I mean, I think there's only a handful of journalists who are not Russian who are actually in the country covering issues that are going on there. And what's happening is that you have news organizations who have hired native-born citizens to do that journalism, and now they are finding themselves
at extreme risk.
In extreme risk, not just them, but their families in extreme risk right now. So basically what's happening is they're saying, look, Putin and his allies are saying, we are going to control the message, and if that means we need to lock everyone up, we will lock everyone up, whether they're non-citizens or citizens. If you're going to report on anything that we deem to be negative toward what we're doing, you're going to find yourself in legal trouble.
And you're seeing the same thing in Hong Kong over and over. There's a dictator's handbook.
So, Kathy, let me ask you this. You've mentioned that people can stop by here on Friday, sign some letters. What are some other things maybe for members of our audience who aren't physically here in mid-Missouri? What can private citizens and those who care about a free press, what types of things can they be doing, especially right now?
Well, you can sign letters. The letters to Evan are available to sign via the Wall Street Journal website. You do not have to be a Wall Street Journal subscriber. The other thing I would do is write to your member of Congress and let the member of Congress, your senator, your House of Representative member, know that this is an important issue. And the other people who are really important to write to are the people who are on the Foreign Relations and Foreign Affairs committees and the appropriations committees, because there are a lot of countries who get U.S. taxpayer dollars in the form of foreign aid who are not following American values when it comes to press freedom. And, you know, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
And I also think that, you know, this is important because as people get their news and information from other sources, especially when you start thinking about what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in the Middle East, it is becoming more and more difficult for journalists to be able to cover those because of what's happening in terms of them getting access. And even when they do get access, the danger that puts them in. So I think that this is something that we as Americans who say that we really cherish press freedom need to be supportive of.
Yeah, if we want this country to be the leader of the free world, we have to care about journalism because that's our eyes and ears.
Yeah.
Okay. Also expecting later this week, we'll likely see updated numbers from Reporters Without Borders for their annual Press
Their
Freedom
Press
ranking.
Freedom Index, yes, that's usually a World Press Freedom Day special. So I would expect we'll be seeing a lot of reports come out at the end of this week about the state of press freedom. And I don't expect the numbers to be great for the United States.
Okay, we'll take a look at that on our program next week. That music means we're pretty much out of time for today, though. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about what we did talk about today on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, and see what else we'll be talking about next week. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, to Takia Thomas for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our theme music, and Nate Brown is our social media manager. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.